I try to judge my classes by how much laughing you do. So if you're enjoying it and laughing, and that tells me you're having a good time. And I really believe learning is enjoyable, okay? Part of my business I call it edutrainment, because that's what I want to do. I want to entertain, but use and teach you in the process of helping you have fun at it to learn something maybe insightful, something inspirational, maybe an idea or something like that, all right? Now, I don't always hit with everybody. Jesus never hit with everybody. How many of you plan to do some teaching in the future? You should all raise your hands because we all teach, all right? Let me give you a miserable truth. When Jesus went out and he taught, he basically emotionally disturbed his audiences. You know that? His audience left very emotionally disturbed. They either left mad, or they left sad, or they left glad. Those are all emotions. And teachers, when they teach, you think about the Pharisees. You know why they're called Pharisees, don't you?
Because they were fair, you see.
They weren't fair, you see. That's right. They weren't fair. They had all these rules. And the Sadducees are sad, you see, because they didn't believe in resurrections. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in a lot of those spiritual things. And Jesus, whenever he taught them, they always left very mad. They did not like Jesus and his teaching. The rich young ruler, it says, after he met Jesus, he walked away sad. But Zacchaeus, when he had his meeting, his moment with Jesus, he left glad. So I figured, hey, there's three emotions. Some of you might get mad by what I say. Some of you might be sad by what I say. Some of you might be glad by what I say. Okay, that's just teaching. Jesus had those moments. As long as none of you put me up on a cross and crucify me this week, I think I'll be okay. All right. That was a joke. Okay. All right. Yeah. There you go. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started here. And we're going to get back right to the video, okay? So let's watch next section. I think it's a little bit shorter, but let's let Mr. Barton teach us some more.
A new group of historical writers began writing textbooks in America. They included Charles and Mary Beard, W.E. Woodward, Fairfax County, and many other writers. Apparently believing that the only thing that mattered in life was money, they began to teach American history with that emphasis, and they introduced what is now called the economic approach to American history. Authoring books like this, The Economic Basis of Politics. They also presented the economic basis of the Constitution, the economic basis of the Revolution, and in other words, economics was the basis. And since the economic clause in the Declaration was taxation without representation, this is the one clause we've learned about in our history books for the past half century. And now, after 2 generations of having been taught that economics is the only thing that matters, our behavior seems to conform to that teaching. For example, 45% of evangelical Christians who voted in recent elections said that economic issues were more important than moral issues. And now we even judge our national leaders, not on the basis of their moral character or other leadership traits, but rather on the basis of how the economy is doing, what the unemployment rate is, or how the Dow Jones Industrial Average is performing. Yet if you read American history textbooks prior to these recent writers, in fact, if you just read the 27 reasons given in the Declaration for why we've separated, you'll find a completely different view of history than that we just taught today. You'll find that issues other than economics motivated most individuals.
You mentioned that there was 27 separate reasons that the signers basically wanted the Constitution. What are some of the top 3 if 17 was, basically taxation without representation?
What we don't get is that you have 11 of those clauses deal with abuse of governmental powers. So they were really against, and it was abuse of representative powers. You had the government, the British government coming in, our legislatures would pass laws, and the British government would say, oh, we don't want that. Great example was we passed a number of anti-slavery laws as British colonies. The British government vetoed every one of them. We passed a number of religious liberty laws. The British government vetoed them. So we called that an abuse of representative powers. We believed in the consent of the government. We believed in the will of the majority, and Great Britain kept setting that aside. We had 7 clauses that dealt with military abuses. One of the problems we had is the military was not run by civilians, it was run by military independent and civilians. So in America, our commander-in-chief is a civilian. We make sure that the civilians are over the military. Yet there are 4 clauses in the Declaration that
that deal with judicial abuses. The founders said, hey, we're tired of being part of a government where the judges make policy. We're going to start our own nation where judges don't make policy. We never hear that judicial activism was an issue in the Declaration of Independence. You also have moral issues. 2 clauses deal with King George won't let us end slavery. We want to end slavery. We're going to start our own nation where we can end slavery. Religious liberties was another big issue in the Declaration. But all we hear is taxation without representation.
This is from 1762, and it is the charter for the very first missionary society in America, the society to propagate the gospel among Indians and others in North America. America thought it was a great idea, but King George III apparently thought that it would compete with the work of the nationally established church, so he vetoed the charter. This type of action by the king did not sit well with a number of the founders who wanted religious liberty in America, including the ability to start missionary societies, Bible societies, or Sunday school societies. Consequently, founding fathers like Charles Carroll of Carrollton and Samuel Adams, who became signers of the Declaration, said that religious freedom was the reason they became involved in the American Revolution. And then there was the issue of slavery. In 1774, Pennsylvania had passed a law abolishing slavery, and other colonies were also making attempts to end slavery, but King George III vetoed those American anti-slavery laws. The king was pro-slavery. The British Empire practiced slavery, and as long as we were part of the British Empire, we would also practice slavery. This position by the king was a source of great discontent for many founders. Henry Lawrence, a president of Congress during the American Revolution, protested against this British position. Lawrence proclaimed,
I abhor slavery, but I was born in a country where slavery had been established by British kings and parliaments ages before my existence.
since the only way for America to end slavery was to separate from Great Britain, many founders decided that separation would be an appropriate course of action. In fact, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he personally penned the clause declaring,
King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating, carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce.
that is, not only has King George III engaged in slavery and the slave trade, but he has even opposed all efforts to stop it. Ending slavery was so important to so many of the founders that when America did separate from Great Britain in 1776, several states began to abolish slavery, including Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and others.
So somebody along the line just decided that America should really remember its past and remember its history through the almighty dollar.
Right.
It's basically what happened.
Because that was all that was of importance to those writers, those particular writers. All they didn't care about God, they didn't care about religion, morality. What they cared about was economics and gain. And so since that's what they cared about, that's what they wrote about. And you'll find that with most writers, they write about the things they care about.
Right.
Well, what happened was we allowed them to be really the writers of textbooks for a number of decades. And so what happens in historical circles is you start repeating what other historians are saying.
Right.
And you pick up their paradigm, and that becomes what the whole universe of historians in that field say. And you forget what your history was. And that's really what they
Why do
did.
you think they chose the economic? Was that really a prevalent thing, and that changed the way that we actually can, our children's reading of history is affected by someone's choice that history should be viewed through the dollar?
Absolutely. It has affected that. It still affects that today. If you look at textbooks today, we still teach economic issues as the basis of what happens. For example, when we teach the colonization and the first colonists that came to America in the Virginia colony, if you will look at current textbooks right now, they say that the Virginia colony was founded to search for gold. Well, if you read the charter of the Virginia colony, that is listed down there about issue 22 or 24 or 26. Way up top was the propagation of the gospel. But since we're going to talk about the economic view, we're going to take this issue way down here in the 20s and elevate it to the number one issue.
Wow.
And so when you look at the colonization aspects that we have in America today,
We say that all the colonists came here looking for land, looking for wealth, looking to get away from economic poverty they had in Great Britain or France or Holland or wherever. That's nonsense. Every single charter for American colonization puts the propagation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a huge thing, but you'll never hear that in a textbook today. That's why it's so important to go back and look at the original documents and not somebody's spin on the original documents. And that's what textbooks do, is spin that writer's view.
All right. Take a moment and chat with your friends. What'd you learn? Anything different?
Well, it's also, we all know the story of the Tea Party. We all know the story so predominantly, and there were these big acts that happened upon it. So it helps with some remembrance of that issue too. Versus like, it's not, we don't remember the other stories so much, so then the other issues just kind of like, just background.
Okay, one more minute. All right, 15 seconds to wrap up those thoughts. Okay. Questions? Comments? Concerns? Yeah.
So, if we came here with the purpose of religion, like freedom of
Yeah.
religion, and to abolish slavery, why did it take us so long to abolish slavery?
First of all, we came for the purpose of religion. I think that's true. There was not an idea of abolishing slavery. The problem was slavery was because we were colonized. When they came, you had to have a charter from England. Whoever was, and this because England owned the land, so to speak. They were the ones that discovered the land, so it was their land. You had to have a charter to actually go to that land. And you had to say, what is your purpose in going? And a lot of the original colonies, the number one reason they were going, for example, the Puritans. The Puritans, the reason they came was because they had a deep need, a deep desire to work among the Indians and to share the gospel with them. Did you know that? I didn't know that. I had no idea, but that was their number one. If you go back and read the charters for Virginia and the charters for these other states, as they mentioned, it was to come in and to be, they're missionaries. They wanted to propagate the gospel. Now, they had other reasons as well. A lot of them were under religious persecution, especially the Puritans in particular. But what was the other? I'm dropping the other name of the group. They were called separatists. Others were called separatists because they had separated from King George, and King George actually came later, but the King of England. In fact, this is where it gets really interesting to me. King James, 1611, King James, the King James Bible came out. King James wrote a Bible because he was Anglican. Basically, he wanted to start his own church, the Church of England. And he had his own Bible, and his own way basically says, if you don't believe the way I want you to believe, as the King of England, then, you're in trouble. And that's why you had these separatists. They would separate away. That's where the Pilgrims came about. The Pilgrims were those who had separated, and they initially went to Holland, and they lived in Holland, I think, a dozen years, the Pilgrims did, before they realized that the reason the Pilgrims, interesting enough, left Holland was not religious persecution. They left England to go to Holland because of religious persecution. They left Holland because their kids were starting to grow up and become more carnal. They were looking at their kids going, we don't want our kids to act this way. We don't want our kids to speak this way. We don't want our kids they're becoming too carnal. And so they said, let's get on a boat and let's go over and go to this place called America at that time. All right? So the charters for that. Now, once they got here, obviously slavery became an issue, especially in the northern colonies, because the northern colonies all were fairly deeply religiously rooted. All the colonies were initially. Georgia was Baptist. But what happened was, especially after 1800, cotton became a big issue. King Cotton, as they called it. And so the southern colonies were really, they didn't want to give up slavery because it was slaves that were kind of keeping their work. It was keeping their work done. So they didn't want to do that. But the northern colonies were flat out against slavery from the very beginning. How many of you have heard that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves? And George Washington owned slaves? Is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is true. It is true. And yet Thomas Jefferson wrote that beautiful quote in the Declaration of Independence. How about he did not like slavery? He wanted that. He put that in there. Did you know Thomas Jefferson didn't want slavery in America? Yeah. Most people don't know that. Because they only focus on the part that he owned slaves. Here's why both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. They lived in a place called Virginia. And the time they lived in Virginia, it was illegal to free a slave. Oh. You couldn't free a slave. And if you did, you remember the movie 12 Years a Slave? It actually comes from a slave narrative, a book. Okay, you can watch that movie. Interesting. It's about a free slave that gets captured and sent down to the deep south where he spends 12 years as a slave. That's what was going on in their Virginia at that time. One of the reasons they didn't free their slaves was because they felt like, you know what, to free them might put them into a worse situation than they are right now. There were actually, I know this is hard to believe, there were a lot of good slave owners as well. There were good slave owners who looked out for their slaves. George Washington spent every last penny he had on his slaves. And then at his death, he released them all. He says, I can't take care of you after I'm gone. But until you die, I'm going to let you marry. I'm going to let you have kids. I'm going to let you build homes on my property. Okay? You don't hear this part of the story. But the reason why they couldn't release, they tried. Both Jefferson and Washington went into the Virginia legislature several times trying to change that law. Virginia would not change it. And it was a law. In fact, it was Virginia right up to the Civil War. You know, that's where Lee was at, was in Virginia. And he says, I'm going to be faithful to Virginia. And I'm not, you know. So Virginia was a slave state all the way through. It is what it is. Yes?
I find it interesting, sorry, we're looking at the money back here, that how we're all like so focused on money now.
Yeah.
On our money, it has our, like what our nation stands for on it too. It says in God we trust, it has liberty, and then it has e pluribus unum. And I was like, what does e pluribus unum mean? So then I looked it up and it says one from many.
Yeah.
And it's like talking about how even though we were all different, we come from different backgrounds, that we are all united.
Yes.
And it's funny that it's on our money just to, as a reminder.
Yeah.
Of the history that we have.
Yeah.
So we're studying like the 10 and the 20, trying to find the pluribus unum. It's on the 5, it's on the 1, it's on all of the change. So we're just studying.
And that's an excellent thought. E pluribus unum, it's Latin, out of many, one. It has been the heartbeat of what it means to be an American. When people come to America, they bring their cultures with them. But one of the things that's happened in the last 30 years in particular is we've started to fracture, you know. And it really started the first time I saw it, and you have to understand, I've been around the planet now 60 years here this May. May 29th, I turned 60 years of age. I know I look still 16, right? But I turned 60 this year. So I've seen a lot of American history. And as an adult, I watched these narratives sort of evolve. I remember the first time I ever heard the word African American. Okay? I thought, that's strange. Why would African American? Because you realize most blacks, even in America, did not come from Africa. There's only about 20% of Americans, black Americans in America that can trace their lineage back to Africa. Only about 20, maybe 26% can do that. Most of them came from the Caribbean. Most blacks they came from the Caribbean. They came from other places, you know. So it's really this idea of being African American, okay, but you know we don't walk around and say, well, I'm European American or I'm, we have Native American. The problem I have with Native American is if you're born in America, you're already a Native American. Yeah. By the way, I didn't mention back on the Indian thing for just a moment. I didn't mention earlier there was a Washington football team that changed their name too, and I want you to know something. I have stood by this for years and years and years because I grew up in Montana among Indians. That R word is as offensive to an Indian as the N word is to a black person. Do you know that? And we had a football team called the Washington R words. That was their name. And a lot of us just said, it's just a name, don't worry about it. We had no problem looking at a whole group of our people and saying it's okay to call them by a derogatory slang word when we would never do it to anybody else. Even among the Hispanic, we've changed how we call, there's a lot of derogatory words for Spanish, right? And I think those are good. Those are good things that have happened in recent years. We've kind of gotten rid of that. But at the same time, Indian itself is not derogatory. Indian itself is not, even among them. It's descriptive of who they are, yeah. They look at, even the hardcore ones today look at it as a political word. They say politically, yeah, it fits us best, but they don't like it. But there is certainly an element that want to erase history, today, and that should be a concern for us.
What do Indians call themselves?
Indians.
Yeah,
Yeah. A lot of them will also call themselves natives because they're proud of that. Indigenous, In Canada, they're known as First Nations. I think that's probably the most accurate word is First Nations. I mean, okay, that makes sense. It's hard to be called a Native American because, again, if you're born in America, as I was, I'm Native American. It's hard to call yourself indigenous because technically in America, everybody migrated from somewhere else. Even the Indians migrated. They weren't indigenous to that area. So it's hard to be indigenous. But with all that said, again, it comes back to those three words I've said all along. Respect, humility, and gentleness. Right? That's how we have our conversations today. Good stuff. Anything else on this particular section of the video that was interesting or have a question? He pretty much nailed the big point I wanted to make in this first session about how we need to just, the history matters. And sometimes we forget our history because we get captivated by other narratives that they just don't tell the whole story.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah. War of 1812, and we almost didn't get a constitution over the issue of slavery.
Yeah.
Like they spent so long arguing over it. Their time was running out. We almost did not get that piece of paper because of the issue of slavery, and that's why they decided to ignore it.
Yeah. You're speaking about the Constitutional Convention in 1789, and you're correct. It was a very contentious argument. It wasn't just slavery, though. There were other issues.
There were, but they had put it in there. It was not.
Yeah. The southern colonies did not like the slavery thing in there. Of course, that was back on the Declaration of Independence. They would not even sign it. That's why Jefferson actually took that phrase out of the Declaration of Independence, because the southern colonies said, we will not sign the Declaration as long as that slavery clause is in there. So he said, fine, it's not the hill I want to die on right now. He says it's more important for us to declare independence, and then we can figure out America in the Constitution. That make sense? That's why he took it out. Jefferson was a master politician. He knew the hills to die on, so to speak.
And they said, in so many years we have to settle this issue.
Right. But when they get to the Constitutional Convention, they have a moment where it is literally, the Constitutional Convention is falling apart. They are arguing, they're griping, they're complaining, they're not getting their way. Everybody's having agendas. And at that point, a man that you know well by the name of Benjamin Franklin,
Yep.
He stood up and said, you know what we need to do? We need to go to church. That's what he said. He says, what we need to do, we cannot build this American idea if we do not have our frame of mind right. And he had this big speech. And he said, listen, guys, what we need to do is, first of all, we need to get chaplains in here. We cannot start each day of the Constitutional Convention without a chaplain having a Bible study with us. Can you imagine that? You don't hear this part of the story, do you? We're going to have a Bible study before we even start our daily activities. We're going to have prayer. But before we even do that, we need to go to church. They dismissed the convention actually, they didn't dismiss the convention. They kept, as far as the order of minutes, they were still all operating as the convention. They then went down to a local church and they worshiped and they prayed and they listened to a preacher speak to them from the Word of God. And when they came back, the Constitution suddenly just came together. People say magically, but for them, they will say it was divinely. In fact, I got a quote here. I think I show it tomorrow. Where Benjamin Rush says, I don't believe that the Constitution was divinely inspired like the Old and New Testaments were, okay? But it's as close as you can get. One of our founder fathers said that about our Constitution. You do realize how special the U.S. Constitution is. It is a paper framework that is so incredibly fascinating and powerful that it has existed almost 250 years. In 2026, we'll be celebrating our 250th birthday as a nation. The average nation in the history of humankind has only lasted 200 years. We're already beyond what the average is. The Romes out there, Rome lasted 700 years. Romes are rare in history. The fact that we're around at that mark. But let me tell you something, my friends. As the old guy in the room, I grieve and I hurt and I wonder if my grandchildren will see America. I really do. When I was in my doctoral studies, we were talking, this was back in the early 2000s, we were talking about some of the great threats to America in one of our studies. And this one thing kept coming up over and over again. And I kept going, man, because I always thought the issue was, at that point, we were fighting a big war in the Middle East, I thought the big issue was maybe more Palestinian, more Middle East. The number one nation that we needed to be concerned about, I kept hearing over and over again in the early 2000s, China. China. And you look today, we need to be concerned about China. We really need to. And a lot of Americans are just kind of, it's about the economy as long as the jobs come back and everything. No. You realize a Chinese spy balloon literally went across America here. It went up into Alaska. Did you hear about that? It went across Alaska, down through Canadian space, into Montana, all the way down across the Midwest, all the way out, and then they finally shot it down over the Atlantic. That happened about 3 or 4 days before the State of the Union address. And, they've now shot down a number of other unidentifiable flying objects, is that how you say it? But, something to be concerned about. Let me show you a quote here. Yes?
It's a quote that I read after reading of finishing the document, and they walk out of the room, and this woman's like, what do we got? Do we got a monarchy or do we got a republic?
Right.
And Benjamin Franklin's like, well, we have a republic
if you can hold it, yeah. Yeah.
Like the people's job to keep it.
Right. And that's the key. America is about we the people. We're the people. We are the ones that elect our representatives. So here's something interesting, and speaking of elections and representatives, James Garfield, one of the few, he was actually a preacher. Did you know that? James Garfield was a preacher. He was one of our presidents in 1880s, but he was the 20th president. He said this thought, or wrote this quote. He says, now more than ever, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. Wow. If that body is ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it is because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. If it's intelligent, brave, and pure, it's because the people demand these high qualities to represent them in the national legislature. If the next centennial does not find us a great nation, it will be because those who represent the enterprise, the culture, and the morality of the nation do not aid in controlling the political forces. Wow. He wrote that in 1876. The next century was 1976. We're now into the century after that. Say, wow. I like what John Jay was the first basically Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He says this: Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer who? Christians for their rulers. You never see this part of our history taught. But our founding fathers actually set up and put together, and relying upon the Old and New Testaments as sources, they put together this Constitution. Let's watch the rest of this session now.
And it's also true that even though the overwhelming majority of founding fathers were anti-slavery, not all were. In fact, Jefferson's forceful denunciation of the slave trade in the original draft of the Declaration was complained about so strenuously by the delegates from Georgia and South Carolina that his clause was removed from the Declaration and a milder condemnation inserted. Nevertheless, the desire to end slavery was a major factor in the thinking of many founding fathers. In fact, this document is the Constitution of America's very first anti-slavery society, and this society was founded by Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Benjamin Rush, both of whom became signers of the Declaration of Independence. And the date on this Constitution is 1774. This society was founded 2 years before we separated from Great Britain. This was an act of civil disobedience. For King George III had said we could not end slavery, but these two founders ignored that fact and worked to end slavery anyway. In fact, Dr. Benjamin Rush led the anti-slavery fight for almost 4 decades and even headed the national abolition movement. For many founders, their desire to end slavery was religiously motivated. Consider, for example, this speech by John Quincy Adams. He so hated slavery and so crusaded against it that he was nicknamed the Great Peloton of Slavery for his unrelenting efforts to abolish that evil. In this speech, Adams cites the Bible passage from Luke 4, where Jesus declared that he had come to set at liberty the captives. John Quincy Adams then notes that if this was the goal of the Savior, it should also be the goal of all Christians. They too should work to end slavery. As you can see, issues such as religious liberties and the end of slavery, and a number of other issues, like the removal of trial by jury, the impressment of American seamen by the British, and the placing of the military power above the civilian power, these were important reasons behind the founder's separation from Great Britain. Yet all we hear about today is taxation without representation.
Just reminds me of that scripture that James says, where do wars and strife come from? It comes from the lust and the greed of your own flesh. I mean, look at what we are now living in because of that.
Well, we've had this for 70 years. It affects the way people behave. It affects, for example, Christians. They often call Christian voters the values voters. Those values voters, in polling, you look at different groups of Christian voters. They have Christian voters, born-again voters, evangelical voters. Evangelical voters are those who take their faith most seriously. They're the ones who live by the scriptures, or at least say they do in polling. And yet, in the last several federal elections, you find that 45% of evangelicals said that when it came time to vote, economic issues are more important than moral issues. Now, that's not living your faith, but that's what you've been taught for 70 years.
Right.
You don't even recognize the influence that it has.
Okay,
And that's a problem.
What you said was really important. Talking about the moral and the economic, because there's a whole group of evangelicals that do that.
That's right.
What gives me more? You know, what about my financial problems?
Well, and see, this affects even the way we analyze news.
Yeah.
Because in recent presidential debates, we've been televising presidential debates since Nixon. And so as you look at recent presidential debates, the last several presidents have had the issue of marriage come up in their debates. It's interesting that in the most recent presidential debates, in the last debate, the word jobs was mentioned 157 times. The word marriage was mentioned once. That didn't stand out to anybody. Nobody knows it because they're supposed to talk about jobs. They're supposed to talk about, well, marriage is a substantial issue. We've seen that in state after state. We've seen it in family after family. It's major to every major religion in America, but it's not talked about, but we don't notice that because we've been taught the economic view of American history.
Dave, I think that if I'm going to take away something from our conversation today is that somewhere along the line, you're talking about mainly the late 1800s, early 1900s, ultimately then in about 1960, the way that we view our history was completely changed.
Yes.
By a set of textbook writers
Yes.
that chose to view history through the almighty dollar.
Let me give you a visual of this, because this is really good. Take someone like Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to America in the 1830s. America grew so fast, we got into what was called American exceptionalism. Around the world, people looked at America and said, how did you do that? I mean, you've only had one revolution, it's been decades. We've gone through a bunch in France and a bunch in Poland, etc. So people came to America as foreigners to see what made us different. Alexis de Tocqueville did that in 1831 to 1834. He went back to France and wrote his findings for the French. So here's what makes America different. Now, he did that in this book right here. This is the book that he did for Frenchmen. It's translated into English, and it also went across America, because here's a Frenchman saying, here's what makes America substantially different. And he goes through, he talks about our faith, he talks about our religion, he talks about that the chief political force in America is Christianity. He talks about you can't go through a town without finding Christian missions. He says they're the ones that take care of the poor, they're the ones, and he goes all through Christianity. Now, this is what we taught in colleges for the next 100 years. We arrive at today. We still teach Alexis de Tocqueville in colleges, but this is the version we use today. Now, I think there's something missing between those two versions.
Wow.
And if you look at this version specifically says in the front that this has been abridged for the modern reader.
Wow.
Well, what is it the modern reader needs here that we didn't have here? The answer is, you read this, they've taken all the religious and moral aspects out. All you have is just a recitation of the governmental aspects, the regulatory aspects, nothing on the faith of America, nothing on the morality of America. See, that's the difference between old historians and modern historians, is they cut out that, and that's how much of American history we've lost in this transition of historical textbooks.
Wow. So, the way we view history is very important.
It is. If we think that government is only about economics, and that's all history is about, that's what we're going to demand from government. But if we go back and read the Declaration and say, no, government's also supposed to deal with moral issues, religious liberty issues, it's supposed to keep judges under control, it's supposed to make sure that the military doesn't get out. If we know our history that way, then that's what we expect in policies today. So what we know of history affects the way we behave right now today. You don't want to trust someone just because they write a book. Go back and check their sources. Go back and see what they wrote about. There's a number of books out now that deal with the founding era. The founding era was from 1760 through 1805. You check the bibliography, all their textbooks are written in the 1960s. Now, why would you study the 1760s out of 1960s books? Go back to the 1760s. And that's what you look for in textbooks, is that reliance on original documentation.
Yeah, and that is really key to understanding history properly. What about this question here? Why is it so important for us as Christians to remember our own history? How would you answer that? Why is it so important for us to remember our own history? Yeah.
I think because it affects the way we vote and the way we go forward with things. And as you can see from what he said, a lot of Christians now separate their faith from how they vote. And it shouldn't be like that. It's really affecting who is going to head our economy and who is going to head our nation. And whenever we are picking away from our faith, we are choosing someone who isn't going to uphold the Bible and what it says and our moral values.
Thank you, Kiliwana.
Kiliana.
Kiliana. Close. Getting closer. Okay, Kiliana. Yes.
I think he answered it in the first video when he said, we don't remember our history, then we don't know where we came from or
Yeah.
where we're going or where we're trying to go. I think the same things for Christians. If we don't remember that this country was built on Christianity and we don't remember what our Christian culture was trying to do in the first place when we came here, then we're just lost in a storm. We don't know what we're trying to do.
Exactly. And if you think about it, if we remember our history, if we know where we come from, and we have the right story, it's our responsibility to tell that story, isn't it? That's what I hope happens here, is I get you excited about some of this stuff. You start to study it out for yourself. You start to understand it. So when you have conversations, you can actually help correct the bad narratives that are out there about our history. You know, we were not founded for economic freedom. We were founded for the propagation of the gospel. Now, you may not like that. The world out there may not like to know that, but that still is our true history. That's our story. Yes.
Our nation was unique and because of what it was built off of. But if we don't maintain what we actually believe, then there's not going to be an America in the future.
Right.
Because we won't be like it will crumble
Right.
like any other nation. We're not susceptible to any other crumbling of nations
Yeah.
like in all of history. Like God raises up nations and he takes them down by literally if they are following him, if they are not following him. At some
Yeah.
point he squashes them if they're
Yeah.
not following him.
Exactly. You know, I told you that I turned 60 this year. I was born in May of 1963, May 29th, 1963, literally 6 months before the John F. Kennedy assassination in Dallas, Texas. Okay? The previous year, in June of 1962, a momentous Supreme Court decision was made to remove prayer from our public schools. That prayer was because there was a Jewish family in New York that started a little lawsuit against their local school district that eventually wound up at the Supreme Court. And it literally took prayer out of schools. It meant that if you were a public school, that you were the separation of church and state, which does not appear in the Constitution as a clause, was there to keep Christians from propagating and praying. Realize that this prayer, if you actually saw these prayers, they were just very benign little prayers to bless the day. It was non-sectarian. It was just a nice little prayer. You didn't have to pray. Here's the thing that's interesting, and then we're going to take a break. The issue that caused that Jewish family to have a problem was not the prayer. That was what came out later. We all think it was the prayer they had a problem with, don't we? It wasn't the prayer. The reason they had a problem with the prayer was because the little boy was asked to fold his hands before he prayed. And at their home, they didn't fold their hands to pray. We've never heard that before. I didn't know that till I studied out that court case. That was the reason. So a little boy doesn't want to fold his hands to pray, and that eventually takes out prayer out of school. And understand at the time, only 1% of Americans even claimed to be atheists or agnostic in 1962. 98.5% of people in the United States in 1962 were Christian or Jewish, and they wanted prayer in school. And that's what's happening today. We have these minorities, extreme minorities, that are basically saying, you need to change all the rules because we don't like it, we're offended by the rules, where the majority is going, well, wait a minute, what's the problem? We like it this way. And we started a precedent with that one. All right, break time.